Okay, hi. So it's Carrie Johnston, and I'm filming today on the traditional territory of Championnet First Nations in beautiful Dakwakata Haines Junction. And my guest today is Inga Petri. Welcome, Inga.
Hi there, it's good to see you, Carrie. I just want to reciprocate. I am in Whitehorse, which is on the traditional territory of the Kwanlundan First Nation and Tanquachan Council, and I'm so grateful to finally have moved to a place where there are self-governing First Nations.
Great. Thanks so much for being here. So could you tell us a little bit about what your business is?
Sure, I'm an independent consultant. My company is called Strategic Moves. As Strategic Moves, I sort of live at the intersection of strategy, research, and marketing planning. My background includes working for about 15 years in marketing and sales, 10 of those years in ad agencies. So I am no longer running marketing campaigns, but I do all of the work leading up to that for my clients. In recent times, I've sort of harkened back to some of that heritage, though, from the ad agency world, which is really about working in the digital world in extensive ways, and predominantly the arts and culture sector.
Hmm. So, you alluded to it a little bit there, or hinted at it. What are you learning about your business over the last 8 months?
You know, I spent about the last 9 years trying to convince people in the performing arts in particular that they needed to think about how to be in and relate to the digital world. And for about 8.5 of those years, I kind of got a bloody head doing that. People weren't ready. Since COVID and the world becoming digital, practically overnight, there's now this sort of indelible need to figure it out. So, so I think in terms of my clients, there's places where, they're incredibly resilient. They're still here. Of all the sectors affected by COVID in really adverse ways, I think the two predominantly affected ones are anyone in the live arts business and restaurants and hospitality, right? So live arts basically nowhere in the country can operate in the way that they used to, and yet they're still here. They're persisting. They're trying to figure out how to be in a world that was really unfamiliar to them. I also am sort of understanding that no matter how much I'll knowledgeably talk about digitization or what the digital world entails, people are only ready when they're ready. Right. So there is that aspect to it. And, anyway, I mean, we'll talk a bit more about what that really means. But in terms of my business, I'm quite known for digital leadership in the performing arts and arts and culture in Canada. So COVID has not been bad for business at all.
In terms of your client base, are you predominantly like Canadian, international, Yukon? Could you give me some ish percentages just so we understand?
No, for sure. Most of my work is outside of the Yukon, but I have been building my sort of Yukon portfolio in the last, since I moved up here in 2015, quite significantly. Mm-hmm. So one of the projects I'm working on right now in the Yukon is with the Yukon Transportation Museum, trying to figure out how to leverage COVID for good. So we're engaging in a process there to try to figure out whether we can build digital business models that would actually generate sufficient revenue for the museum to largely cover some of its basic operations. And those revenue streams are intended to come from outside of the Yukon. So think of it as, can the Yukon Transportation Museum become a global museum, in fact, operating on mandate, doing the things it's supposed to be doing, but figuring out how to build, sort of a completely different business model. So that's one kind of example. Over the summer, I've led a process with a really interesting, diverse group of people around Creative Lab North. It's a very ambitious project that is trying to imagine a world where virtual reality, augmented reality, extended reality media basically come together with dance and theater and visual artists and all of that sort of, building a big sort of home for these really diverse creative endeavors and figuring out how to build that kind of an industry up here. That excites me to no end. As you know, the Yukon has two kinds of industries: government, which is great, very consistent, and cyclical industries and seasonal industries. So tourism and mining come to mind, right? So this would be a very different sort of aspect to that. So those are a couple of Yukon examples. Other than that, I spent most of my time really working with clients from British Columbia to Nunavut to sort of the Atlantic region, doing a really wide range of fairly innovative work, both around digital literacy and intelligence, figuring out what amazing, awesome, connected online experiences would feel like, how to do online conferences, to doing work around sort of digital showcasing. That's actually a project led out of Whitehorse as well, with Debbie Peters from Magnum Opus Management, the only agent manager north of 60 in the country. And so we're working together on figuring out a business-to-business application. It's amazing to be able to lead that out of the Yukon at this point. Like that's certainly one of the nice things about doing work in the digital realm. It's digital. It doesn't really matter where we are. I should tell you that recently I've gotten some requests from both New Zealand and Australia where networks, art service organizations are looking for the kind of intelligence I have to offer. And it seems that who they're landing with is me. So they're figuring out how to find me up here in Whitehorse from sort of the other side of the world. So that's kind of cool. We'll see where that goes. But there was sort of a sweet spot in terms of the thinking and approach that I've taken over the last decade or so to try to get arts and culture organizations to better understand what the digital world actually might be to them and how it might be useful. So it goes much beyond marketing and figuring out how to use Facebook into sort of trying to figure out what does a business look like that is a digital business. And as you might imagine, it's easier to start a digital business than it is to convert or transform an existing business that's very much in the bricks and mortar world, particularly if it's about convening people into something that would be much more significant in the digital realm, right? So that's a bit of a mind, it's a shift that's hard to make for anybody, including myself. So we're figuring that out together now, which is pretty cool.
Well, that's all really exciting stuff to hear about. What are you learning about your clients sort of as you're, sussing things out over the last couple of months?
One of the things I love about working in the creative industries, so arts, culture, creativity, whether that's on a commercial basis, like what architects and photographers and designers might do, or whether that's, dancers and theater people and, people in the classical orchestra world or something like that. They're figuring, they're really good at problem solving. The problem they're having now is that they're not solving a problem anymore. Like what's just happened in terms of COVID is far beyond, I have a problem, what's the solution, right? It really is a systemic change, which is harder, but they're kind of, they're just kind of through. It's a complicated thing to do. There's a profound array of structures that exist, both from, unions for musicians and unions for actors, different ones for stage actors than for broadcast actors, right? It's a very intricate system that's been built. None of that works digitally, right? So it really is trying to start fresh, and doing that as an organization that exists is a much different challenge. And it does require, perhaps the kind of guidance that people like myself and, other folks sort of across Canada can actually offer, and just helping people think without fear. Like to me, it's all opportunity, but if I was invested in a particular system, it's all liability, right? So that's sort of like a real pivot point that people are sort of, bit by bit working through.
Do you think that people have really actualized the extent of this pandemic yet, in the time frame that we're looking at?
Oh no, not at all. I think we're all naive. What's the last time we had a pandemic like that? It's about 100 years ago. And if, perhaps Indigenous folks, First Nations around the Yukon may have, and around the world may have more recent experiences of dealing with serious pandemics over the last few hundred years. My people didn't. The only thing that's equivalent would be actually wars and the kind of destructive power and rebuilding that follows that. This pandemic response in a lot of ways feels very much like that. So far more profound than it's a 4-week shutdown, far more profound than, oh, I'm gonna be on an extended vacation for 8 weeks. I mean, I think, people's lives are being upended in profound ways, and we haven't really had to feel it because there's been a lot of government support to cushion that. I think if that disappears, and when that disappears, we're going to see a very different reality. So I know, and I think, in the Yukon, we think about tourism a lot. That's probably the most immediate example. I think people are optimistic if they think that there'll be a tourism season next year. So I'm interested in thinking about, how do you put a place on the map like the Yukon when it has to be digital for a while? And there's lots of ways to do that. There probably aren't a website, right? I think the world has moved much beyond that. So I think that's something where, people who know less about how the digital realm has evolved in the last 25 years, or they keep talking to me about websites, and I keep saying, no, that's a nice idea, but it's not what we need now, right? Anyway, so I realize I'm diverging a little bit, but that's sort of like the train of thought that, sort of occupies my days these days, which is we have to understand enough about the digital realm, how it is today and where it's headed, not what we actually know it to be, right? And that's a very different thing to do. And in the Yukon, we're not exactly in an advantaged place when it comes to internet speed or capacity or our ability to reliably do things online.
Mm-hmm. So what are you learning about leadership over the past 8 months?
Yeah, I was referring to a bloody head a few minutes ago. I think my favorite definition of leadership is you're a leader when you have followers. Until you have followers, you're just doing business. You're doing your own thing. It's fine. You might even make lots of money, and that's great, but you're not leading anything until people are prepared to follow. And that's been a realization, I think, for me personally in the last little while is, people would have called me a leader, for instance, for the last number of years, but nobody was following. And I think that's been really a shift in the last 8 months, where I have the right ideas, I have enough of the right know-how, and I'm known enough for having, gotten a bloody head for, 8.5 years, so that people now know where to find me. But that's an interesting, it's an interesting piece to me to sort of think about, what really is a leader and what is a leader in business. I don't think there are that many of them. I think there are lots of people who do a great job being in business, but that doesn't mean you're a leader in your community or a leader in a sector or a leader, that is really affecting more than just my bottom line, but that's actually making a difference in a far greater way. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting conversation to me about where we each play. And, I'm an independent consultant, but I can lead the country in the performing arts when they're trying to figure out how to be in the digital world. That is unusual. That is not how we ordinarily would think of that, right? Like you'd have to be some major company or institution to claim that kind of thing. It's also an effect of the digital world, of course. I just need a website and I'm real.
Well, and that's part of it in this space is like we're really kind of designing for emergence right now, and so there's a lot of opportunity for unknown players or emerging players to claim some space in a new economic paradigm, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of like one of the big changes that's happened for me in the last 8 months, quite frankly, is I was happy being independent consultant, taking 2 or 3 months off a year. Our honeymoon got converted into a working this year. Like there's just like a lot of things we had planned for didn't happen. But I also decided that I was saying yes to a lot of projects, sort of in April, not knowing exactly how things would fall out for me. And as a result of that, I had to bring in 4 different consultants to farm out pieces of these projects that I've said yes to, because there is no way for me to actually handle them on my own. And those are consultants in Victoria and Temiskaming, Northern Ontario, strange places like that, and Montreal, Ottawa, like they're all over the place. And there's something about sort of, that's a very distributed way of leading significant, visionary, truly innovative, not been seen like that before work, in a whole bunch of different dimensions. All focused on arts and culture. Lots of that is transferable to any other sector as well, in terms of the basic knowledge that we're generating. I wouldn't have gone there. I would have been happy to take my 2 months off a year. But that is part of, I think, just a sort of that response to this reality that we're in. And, dealing with uncertainty, both, personally, but also, when entire sectors are threatened, and including those that I work with predominantly, you're hedging differently, right? Mm-hmm. You're making different choices as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how are you thinking about your business on the go forward? Like what does your next couple of months and years look like?
Basically, like the way it is now, I'm fully committed well into next year. I'm still saying yes to things. And it's, so for a long time, I've been an independent now for 14 years, since 2007. And for a long time, I had a very simple business plan. The business plan is that I want to do transformative work. There's nothing else to it. I just want to do transformative work. And there's a number of things that implies. One of them is that I don't like to do work that is repetitive. I like to do interesting work. Now, the double-edged sword on that right now is that all the projects I work on are interesting. So they're really demanding. They're demanding intellectually. Every one of those projects requires me to learn new things and to make sense of things that don't exist yet, so that people can make decisions and take actions, right? So the demands intellectually are like, my brain hurts. It's a bit of a concern sometimes, just how taxing that is. There's also this part where I never really was into empire building. Like, I just want to do strategic moves. I want to be independent. I want to have a simple world. Working with 4 other consultants is not simple. And, they're all adults. They all know what they're doing, but they're not me. They don't have my brain. They have, right? They're their own people, and I'm working with them for reasons. But there is a whole sort of other kind of way in which that is taxing, and more complex. We get more work done. So, that is appealing, of course. But I'm personally kind of going like, maybe I really just want to figure out how to get back to taking 2 months off a year soon. Because this has not been sort of feeling sustainable. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many days I've taken off since March. Well, let's say since May. I think that might have been 6 days so far, like that I actually took off. And that's definitely not sustainable. And I think I'm not the only one in that sort of scenario, both for positive reasons and negative reasons, right? Anyway.
No, I think that's a common story I'm hearing from a lot of people in leadership. Is they've been running for a long time now, and they know that the road ahead is still there's a long way to run. Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, and and in part of that, you want to be responsible to the work you're doing. I want to be responsible to the relationships I've built. So it's interesting. It's like I'm in business, but I'm not, right? I'm really in the relationship sort of building business as a consultant, and I take that very seriously. So when I get 3 strategic plans in a year, and I get some really cool marketing projects, 4 or 5 of those a year, and I get some extra projects, that's a full slate. I don't really need more than that, and I don't want more than that. Right now, I'm working on probably about 15 digital projects and a handful of regular strategic sort of assignments. It's great work. It's interesting work. I love all that stuff. But the sustainability of that is absolutely a significant issue. Mm-hmm. Trying to figure out if I should say yes to the next big Yukon project or to the next, cool opportunity coming out of New Zealand. Those are tough choices, right?
Mm-hmm. They there. How are you keeping yourself well? What are some of the things that you're using to keep yourself a bit grounded?
Honestly, barely is the answer. It's I don't know. It's, I don't know. We rescheduled this call a couple of times because we're getting firewood. So that's a health practice to me. I got to be outdoors. We got to do stuff. There's a big snowstorm today, so we shuffled a bunch of snow around the house. That took about whatever 2 hours, a bit more. And I think that physical activity piece is key for me, and it's been really hard to come by it. But that's you got to look at trees. You got to be in the woods for sanity. I spent easily 12 or 14 hours looking at a screen every day, which is a strange way to be, right? I'm used to it. Lots of that works for me, but it certainly is a challenge to sort of try to balance that, especially when it's kind of strange to want to go to a gym, and it's kind of strange to be like, just the restrictions, what they are, and the sort of concerns right now, right? And just time, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, it's definitely a challenge.
What do you have you taken up any new skills? Are you learning anything new?
No, I'm just using them all now. No, it's like, I've been independent for a long time. I've been working remotely for about 25 years. Even when I was working at an ad agency in Ottawa, we used WebEx on a regular basis in the late 1990s. Like, there's really no appreciable difference to the things I do. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the projects I'm working on, the content of projects, is really intellectually challenging, but that's different from a skill set. Like, my skill set is research, marketing, and strategy. Those are the skills I'm using. I keep them sharp. I understand, I understand enough about the real world and the virtual world to be able to sort of live in both places reasonably well, personally and professionally. So it's really not about skill sets, right? It's really about leveraging. For me, it's been really much more about leveraging the kind of things I know, and finding ways to speak in ways that my clients can understand it and do something about it. That really, that sort of ability to speak English as opposed to marketing or strategy or researchy type jargony stuff, is a big part of what I do. And the sectors I work in predominantly are not known for knowing a lot about those things. They use them all the time, but they would never recognize it. Right. So that translation function continues to be really important, and I keep honing that.
Gosh, I think that's been a big learning for me in a communications perspective, is this jargon or language that we use that is so inherent to our worldview. And I think we're all learning that, and having to learn all these epidemiological terms because of COVID. What does a cluster mean, or what does the infectability period mean? And our doctors and public health professionals can roll those things off, and what I glean out of it versus somebody else is so different. So it's really trying to marry these languages together, so that we're all actually speaking the same language, even though we're all using English.
Well, and language is one aspect to that, absolutely, Carrie. But the other one is, what does it mean? Right? Like, there is a real nuance between just the words we use and the meaning those words have. And the Safe Six are a great example. The Safe Six are not universal. They're different in different places. In the Yukon, they're not the same as they are in Ontario. Right? Meaning is very contextual, and meaning is something that we create together as a society, as a business, as a community. And I think that layer is actually much more complex to try to unpack. And that's been interesting. It has implications for the work I do as well. I mean, both in terms of saying to, sort of being less optimistic than clients want to be, to say, no, actually think about it. Can you not operate for 2 years? And can you really not operate for 2 years? And you realize quickly that that's actually tough for them to be around. So they have to figure out how to be digital in some fashion, right? But also, I think, so there's part of that meaning creation is about, how do we forward look and make some decisions that are reasonable because of that. But there's also just this part about how, in the digital world, we talk a lot about machine readable data. which is very clinical. It makes it appear like, a thing is a thing, but it's like, no, we still need humans to interpret. We still need, our brains to sort of supersede the engine, the computer, to actually really understand together what these things actually mean. It's an interesting tangent to sort of the public health messaging and communications, that some of them have been successful and some of them just massively confusing, right? Because the meaning part of it has been harder to agree on.
I think social bubble is one of those ones that's been, because many people would think like, this is my bubble and you can't come into it. And yet we've flipped the language to mean this is my social bubble and this is who's in it. And this is my protective, set. So it's been just the simple language of bubble has been confusing.
Yeah, and we moved from social distancing to physical distancing.
Yes, we did.
Right, yeah. just on the straight semantics of that, very different meanings. Absolutely, absolutely.
Which of the Safe Six, Yukon Safe Six, have you found the hardest to apply in your life?
None really. I mean, I work at home. I've been a remote worker forever. Antoinette's my wife, Antoinette Green Olive, and she goes out a heck of a lot more than I do. So the way we live at this point, it sort of favors the introvert in me. There hasn't really been a big challenge. The biggest one really tends to be about sort of physical activity and, perhaps not participating in a squash league this year and things like that I would have ordinarily done, and just finding other ways to deal with that. But in terms of the basic rules, I mean, they're very straightforward. And, I'm not working at an office. I'm not a teacher. I don't have to deal with 30 kids in the classroom or anything like that, right? So it's a much simpler world, and 80% of my work was digital anyway, so 100% is not a big jump. I still work with clients all over the country, even though I haven't been on a plane in months, right? Which would have been a normal occurrence for me for a long time. I'd just be flying somewhere every month or 3 weeks or something like that. And that certainly is gone, which makes for a saner life in some sense. And figuring out how to do workshops digitally is a slightly different skill set than doing them in person, but not anything that I haven't been acquainted to for a long time either, right? So those shifts just aren't daunting to me. They kind of suit my personality, if anything.
Fair enough. I think there are many people who agree. Yeah. Have you had any sort of major worldview shifts over the last 8 months where, your head's pointing in a different direction?
Speaking of innovative digital work, I think the one thing that I've realized in the last while doing, I was doing some presentations for Canadian Heritage around digitizing the performing arts and where we're at. So this was like in June and September for folks at sort of the federal ministry. And talking about digital, digital used to be just global, right? Like that was the equation. And what is really different to me now is that there's two things that I think about digital now that I didn't before. One of them is that digital is actually hyper-local. And that's very different from anything we would have said, before COVID, I think. And the other part is that digital is incredibly intimate. So like people who don't maybe spend as much time on a screen as I do, or don't have 3 Zoom meetings a day and whatever, a couple of conferences a month or something to speak at or something, may have a different view of that. But the way that a lot of people are now behaving and organizing themselves, the digital sort of mediation of that is in fact as intimate and as real to us as meeting in person would have been. And I think those two ideas, the sort of the hyperlocal and intimate aspect, is massively different. And it actually changes how you can design business models. It changes what you would ever imagine that anybody would pay you for, which, I actually find that fairly exciting and far more liberating than daunting. But those are actually really big conceptual changes to try to make sense of moving forward.
It's been interesting. Some of Heritage Canada, some of their content's been showing up on my TikTok feed, and I've been finding that fascinating that it just shows up every once in a while. And it's such an interesting place for those commercial or like that typical digital content that they've had before to show up, and it's been great. I've enjoyed receiving it.
Yeah, and there's no barrier, right? Like a government with reasonably deep pockets for advertising can be in exactly the same places that you and I as an individual can be. And we compete on a far more equal level playing field than we ever would have, when you think about, I don't know, buying television ads. Right? There is a sort of significant shift there. It does challenge us to try to figure out whether something is authoritative and can be trusted. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a real skill set there in terms of media literacy and just understanding whether what you see is real, whether fake news is fake news, right? That whole sort of aspect of it. It's very easy to manipulate people at the best of times, let alone when they're on Facebook. Right? I mean, as a marketer, we have to admit that. We try to change behavior all the time. In my business, it's buying performing arts tickets is fairly harmless. Right? Not everything that happens in that realm is harmless, obviously. Mm-hmm. But those are some significant pieces that we really need to grapple with. Mm-hmm. The other thing, but just because you mentioned, so the other thing that's really different is some of the projects I'm working on, nationally in particular, are trying to figure out whether we can build a better world digitally than we've ever managed in the physical realm. And the pieces that really come to bear there is equity and access. So Indigenous lives matter, Black lives matter, brown people, people of color, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, two-spirit. Like those are communities I have affinity with, I'm part of. And in the physical world, we don't really play that well, right? Like it's difficult. And when bad things happen, those are groups that are systemically disadvantaged and discriminated against still today, notwithstanding legal frameworks. So there's a number of people who are trying to figure out in the digital realm how to build something better. And a lot of that has to do with algorithms. A lot of that has to do with how do we find information? Who do we get to discover? Who gets to make those decisions? Do I really want a bunch of techies who are in a, male 20-something hotshots, great coders? Do I want them to decide what I get to discover as a lesbian in the Yukon? Not really, right? So that there's some real hope there. And I think there's some leading projects around the country that are really grappling with that. One of them is trying to figure out how to embed land acknowledgement, like the territory we're on, up front. So we don't start with, I'm in Toronto, but I'm starting with, who are the five First Nations whose land I'm on? And today that's called Toronto, right? And just figuring that out, because those geographic, markers, of course, are completely different from our city markers or the boundaries that sort of the current version of Canada uses, right? Being in Whitehorse, there's two First Nations whose land I live on. And they don't have the same boundaries. There's just an intersection that's called Whitehorse and a bit of other stuff, right? Anyway, so it's, I'm pretty stoked about people actually trying to figure that out, and that we get to think about that in application. In a year or two, some of that will come to fruition, I would hope. It's not instant, obviously, right? But those are some sort of big opportunities that some of us are trying to, really promote and leverage now. That wouldn't have existed before COVID, quite frankly. Nobody was really, it's not that people weren't thinking about that, it's that they were thinking about it in isolated ways. They were individuals having interesting thoughts. Now we're able to find each other and we're able to sort of, think together in ways that just didn't happen before. So that's pretty cool.
I do find that like in many ways, my network is expanding because the friction of distance is no longer present, right? And it's that no longer thinking about our, definition by the sort of by what we've been seeing on a map historically.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think You got a sense of that earlier in terms of my work is as easily done in, in Fredericton and Moncton, New Brunswick as it is in Whitehorse or in Dawson City or in Iqaluit. And a lot of that, I'm realizing that a lot of that is based on, I've built those relationships for the last decade. We know each other. It's hard to build that strictly digitally. It's harder to build that strictly digitally, but it's actually not impossible. Right. And you can certainly carry on quite powerfully for a while, years into the future, just having that base of understanding sort of what drives different people, what the ethics are, what sort of the value systems are, and work with people that you want to work with on really leading interesting work.
What are your hopes for the Yukon economy as we've been through a bit of a reset and we're, we talk about being in a rebuilding phase now. So what are your hopes for that?
That's a great question. One of the things, I lived in Ottawa before I came to Whitehorse, so the capital city. And whenever there's upswings in the Ottawa economy, like Toronto might go like this, Ottawa goes like that, right? The ups are not as up and the lows are not nearly as low. So I think we do have to recognize that, with 43% or something like that of, employed Yukoners working for a government, any of the 4 levels of government, that's not going to go away anytime soon. And we need to sort of just be happy with that. The other part is that we need to figure out even industries that don't look like they're tourism dependent, like retail, like restaurants, dine-in restaurants in particular, actually are massively tourism dependent. And I think we need to grapple with that. I think we need to understand that we need to build an economy that is not cyclical and that is not seasonal, which is one of the reasons why that Creative Lab North idea and actually having a bunch of people who are not in government, but motivated individuals from creative sectors, really understanding that they could be that next sector that is sort of building strength and creativity and finding solutions to problems we didn't even know we had yet, and can do that in the long term. And it requires, sort of a sweet spot of, infrastructure, technology, savvy folks who can, put things together in new ways. I think supporting those kind of ideas is going to be essential. We're small enough to build to build a different economy. Like, it's hard to move Ontario. It's hard to move Canada. It's not hard to move 37,000 people, 40,000 people, right? That's actually, in relative terms, quite easy, but we might have to make some different choices about what we invest in. And I think, if anything, COVID gives that opportunity to not stay tethered to old ways of being and old values, but to actually figure out how to take care of each other and to figure out how to build something that is far more lasting, that doesn't happen from May to October if you're lucky, right? There might be some other opportunities similar to that. I'm not sure. That's just the one that I'm sort of most familiar with. And any chance I'll get to talk about it, I will. So thank you, Carrie, for letting me do that.
Well, it's been my pleasure. My pleasure. What advice do you have for emerging entrepreneurs?
That advice never changes, right? I think just because in a way, starting at difficult times is easier. If you can operate now, you'll be fine. But I think it's important that you know your stuff. You got to have the expertise you claim to have. You got to build amazing relationships, which is another way to say have a great brand. People need to trust you. Businesses don't hire people. People do, right? People hire consultants. A business doesn't do anything without people that make decisions. And I think it's important to remember that. I think the other part is you've got to really, there's a certain amount of fearlessness, right, that comes with starting anything. What I know most about is being a consultant. I've been doing this for a long time. And I think the thing that people who've talked to me about, sort of becoming a consultant always underestimate is that they have to be good at working on their own. They have to be self-motivated. Nobody is gonna ever tell you when you should be done with a thing. And there's no distractions except for the ones you create. So make sure you don't create too many. It's a real challenge, right? And I think that kind of self-discipline is important. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to learn that. Anyway, so those would be a few sort of notions. And I think a lot of that holds true no matter what. And back to your question about wellness, it's like, my goodness, start to be well from the start, because once you burn out or you get these really, horrible effects in your life, whether that's personal or health-wise, doesn't really matter, but all kinds of really, unintended things can happen. And if you can just build that into your vision up front and kind of go like, yeah, I'm not working every weekend. I'm not working just because there's work. There'll still always be work. You're either doing the projects or you're working on the business, right? So like you gotta gate that. Have time for the things that actually matter in life that are not work.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Any podcasts, books, movies, things that you'd recommend to the audience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I read a lot and all of that, but I don't follow anybody. I think that the thing that I draw most inspiration from is probably my wife these days, who, I don't know, she's been a significant sort of business and community leader in Whitehorse for a long time. And, I think there's just something about the way of being that combines, doing good things in business and doing good things in the community. That's where I groove. That's where I want to pay attention. Not so much about, what's the latest TED talk on something momentous. And yeah, I mean, notwithstanding all the reading I do, I never ever get an answer for the question about that.
Come on, there's gonna be like a tune that you and Antoinette like jam out to every once in a while that gets you through.
I don't know. What's the tune we jam up to every once in a while to get us through? There's an awful lot of Melissa Etheridge, I'm afraid. Too many breakup songs. Kind of ironic. We should listen to Celine Dion more, actually. Yeah. Celine's good. We love Celine.
Perfect. That's a perfect classic Canadian pick.
No, that's pretty funny. No, music is kind of a big deal. We listen to a lot of music. I've been getting acquainted with all kinds of, Topagonian and Calypso and stuff that I never had to pay attention to. So I'm actually really enjoying that. And I don't understand half of it, but it's awesome.
Perfect. That's fantastic.
See, that's how we stay young, right?
That's right. Yeah, you just got to push your boundaries.
Totally.
Learn a new dance, a new tune.
Totally. And I think Antoinette gets regaled by, some of the German radio stations I listen to and all that. So that's part of the beauty of the internet these days. I get to actually hear the weather forecast in Frankfurt all the time. And the traffic. Traffic is a big deal. Anyways, but yeah, so those are sort of the cultural intersections.
Inga, thanks so much for your time today. It's been really great to chat with you.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. Really appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Okay, take good care.